Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar with Groundsure, which is going to look at mining in the cities. And in particular today, we're going to look at Leeds during today's webinar. My name is Faye Stenning, and I'm a marketing manager here at InfoTrack. I'm delighted to be joined by Tom Harvey-James, who's a mining consultant at Groundsure, and Andy Crawshaw, who's also a senior account manager at Groundsure, and they're both going to be taking you through today's session. So before we begin, I'd just like to draw your attention, please, to the Q&A tab, which you'll see located at the bottom of your screen. We will be running a question and answer session at the end of this webinar, so please type in any questions that you might have for either Tom or Andy, along with your name, into the Q&A box. That way, if we run out of time or your question requires further clarification, we can extract your information and follow up with you directly after the webinar. So I'm now going to hand you over to Tom, who's going to take you through the first part of this presentation. Thanks ever so much.
Thank you, Faye, and morning, everybody. As Faye introduced me, I'm Tom. I'm one of the mining consultants here at Groundsure, currently in our Cornwall mining team, so down in sunny Cornwall. And sat in one of our lovely rooms dedicated to a man called William Bickford, a famous mining inventor. So quite apt, really, for today's webinar. So we're going to cover off a few things during today's talk. We'll cover a little bit about mining itself, and to put that into perspective, we'll focus on Fireclay mining, particularly in Leeds, as well as a few others, but we're going to really focus on Fireclay, have a look a bit about some of the actual risks which that includes and what that involves. Of course, touching on the data that we use here at Groundsure that goes into our reports, and then Andy is going to kindly finish off with explaining some of the reports that data goes into. So without further ado, this is a slide which I find quite helpful when talking to people, really, because mining, we all have an idea of what it is, really. It's kind of a commonly known thing, but to put it into perspective of how such of an industry it actually is, this quite helps to do that. So it is simply the extraction of minerals or geological deposits from the earth. And when speaking to a peer within this field, she once said to me that everything you see around you has either been grown or mined, which is something when I'm out and about meeting clients and talking to them, I usually drop into conversation, because it gets people looking around them, it gets them looking at the laptop in front of them, the metals that are in that, the wood that's in their desk, things like that. And they realize actually that's not too far from the truth, really. Everything around you has either been grown or mined, especially the thing that is probably sat in your pocket or on your desk right now, your smartphone. Almost everybody has one of these. And they are made up of a host of a variety of minerals, from things that are more common that people can relate to and have heard of, such as tin, carbon, iron, copper, even gold, right up to things that people perhaps haven't heard of before. Some of the rarer earth metals, europium and yttrium, silicon as well, antimony. There are a whole host of variety of metals, and this is just some of them that go into making a smartphone. You think these all have to be mined and extracted from the earth. So another good way to consider the demand for mining is to consider the need for minerals and materials within the mining industry itself. So all these things that are in our everyday lives that need either metal or stone, and especially when moving into a more of a greener way of living, many of us are looking at perhaps having an electric vehicle or installing solar panels on our roofs, or if we've got land, maybe like a small turbine or something. And all of these things demand the need for mining. So it's an industry that has got a lot of stick historically, and probably quite rightly so, really, for not being the greenest of industries. And obviously that is a fair analysis given the history of mining throughout the whole world. But I don't think that really stopping it in all its instances is really a feasible thing, when you think that we need some of these metals in order to progress into the greener way of living. And so by doing that and looking at the fact that the mining industry itself, to function, to create those materials, is going to need mining itself to run. So there's a demand for, there has always been a demand for coal historically to power the foundries to produce the steel, whether that's mined within the UK or imported elsewhere. And then steel is required to make the tools in order to mine the coal to power the foundries. So there's a bit of a loop there. Of course, historically, coal was used to power pumping engines and steam locomotives before the introduction of diesel. And these allowed miners to go deeper in both coal and metal mines. And bricks were mined in the brick fields. Clays, shales, and limestones, chalks were mined in the brick fields to create bricks, even. And these were used to create mine buildings, foundries themselves, and things for the miners to actually live in. So you can see how the cycle can go on and on and on. And that's just the demand for the mining industry in order to produce these metals and these materials that we use in our everyday lives. So there is a variety of different types of mining, and I have said it before, but we'll say it again that there could be an entire webinar series on delving deep into every single type of mining. But a few key ones that you might have heard of, some that you wouldn't have heard of. So one really primitive early form of mining is bell pit mining. There's some images there on that you should be able to see. You can see a sort of narrow shaft which bells out at the base, was excavated by hand to create this excavation which looks like a bell, hence the name. And these is an early form of mining that works deposits found close to the surface, and typically found to be in the order of 15 meters deep. And this is restricted to kind of the primitive techniques available to the miners in terms of controlling the stability of the mine, risk of any collapse, and just the tools that they had and understanding of the geology they had at the time. So as I said, they would sink a narrow shaft to access the deposit before working the mineral out by hand, leaving this bell-shaped excavation. And then this mineral was typically winched to surface via a bucket and a windlass, much like you would think of like an old school well, just with a little windlass at the top. These are highly unstable workings, so as soon as this pit became unstable, the miners would typically return to surface, go a few yards either side, sink another shaft adjacent to the previous one, and hope to come down onto the mineral they were mining again. We typically see these looking for ironstone and coal. And of course, we are focusing today on Leeds, where both ironstone and coal have been worked, along with fireclay. So these are various minerals that often occur within coal seams. So they're looking for these sorts of minerals. We've also got open cast working, sometimes referred to as open pit or open cut mining. On this image, it's referred to as surface working. So this is when minerals are found in commercially favorable quantities near the surface. So the miners here need only to remove a thin layer of overburden which exposes the economically viable mineral without the need for tunneling deep underground. And these are very often seen today as huge surface excavations cut down into the ground via a series of benches, so those sort of steps. So these aren't just for coal. We do see open cast workings for other sort of minerals as well. Quarrying, of course, is very similar for stone. And down here where I am, based in Cornwall, we have the famous Centostal China clay tips. If any of you have ever had the joy of driving along the A30, you would have seen them. They're quite clear in the landscape and quite a part of our heritage. And these are really interesting. You know, they produce a lot of kaolinized clay. And sometimes these surface excavations, whilst they started out at surface, sometimes they do go underground. So they would have the surface quarry, and then they drive portals or headings into the face of that quarry. If they find the mineral may be economical at depth too, then they can expand tunnels from the base of the quarry and expand into those mines. We've also got pillar and stool workings there. We're not going to mention that now. We're going to come back to that in a bit when we look at some of the fireclay workings relating to Leeds itself. So now a little bit about what you'd expect to find in Leeds. I have mentioned, of course, that we have coal and ironstone being worked here, but with the main focus on fireclay, we're going to go over a little bit about what that actually is. So fireclays is it's a collective term composed of a host of sedimentary mudstones. And these are commonly found beneath a majority of thick coal seams found in the region. Due to the way these beds are often deposited around coal measures, it's kind of understandable then why much of the fireclay exploited here is in fact named after the coal seams they sit below. So the coal seams usually get named for sake of knowing what they're mining, where the coal has come from, and for the abandonment plans. So for these fireclay workings, which are often found beneath or above the coal beds, these usually carry on with those names as well in terms of identifying them. And the term fireclay covers a variety of different clays found throughout the country, but predominantly in the Midlands and Northern districts. And whilst exact compositions do vary, its prime characteristics and function kind of remain constant. It's able to withstand intense fluctuations of heat, and in some cases of really high grade fireclays can be subjected to over 1500 degrees Celsius of heat without breaking. And so you can understand that it makes perfect material for lining fireplaces, creating chimney pots, and indeed stone crucibles. So these would be used in the iron and steel industry for melting these metals. So this also demonstrates the part that Fireclay played in the expansion of the iron production. These are really quite famous in parts of Yorkshire, particularly around the ironstone mines and foundries of Cleveland. These Fireclays would have played an immense part in those industries. So touch on a little bit about the mining risk in Leeds. So, of course, recently we published our white paper titled Hidden Hazards, Understanding Non-Coal Mining Property Risks. And what you can see here is that we hold over 8 million data points about past potential mining activity that could affect land and property. And these are all in addition to coal mining. So if we look at the infographic on the screen there, this relates to non-coal mining risk found in Leeds. And so you can see that there is 237,745 properties in Leeds that are estimated to be, that could be affected by non-coal mining. We've got 2,222 recorded non-coal mine shafts, over 1,500 quarries, and 162 gravel pits. And so you can also see there that over 45% of all properties in Leeds lie within our non-coal alert area. Of course, if you didn't want further information about the white paper, you are able to download it from the Groundsure website as well. So looking at what has been mined in Leeds. Coal, this one is something that most people can relate to. It's something that they are familiar with as well in these areas. It's kind of like the lifeblood of industry for these neck of the woods. It's played an immense part in the local heritage and industry. Similarly, ironstone, that's again something that is relatively well known of for Leeds. Less so perhaps the Fireclay, which is why I wanted to kind of focus on this today. And on a smaller scale, sand and gravel, we mentioned that as well in the previous slide, and other forms of clays as well. So looking predominantly now on an area in Royds Lane, which is now a residential development in Leeds. I wanted to point out that Fireclay on its own was not always a commercially viable operation, and sometimes relied on being mined alongside other deposits like coal and ironstone to become a profitable business venture. It was sometimes mined during open cast operations, but in some instances, many instances, Fireclay was mined beneath the surface in vast deep workings like those found near Royds Lane in Leeds. So what's curious is if we look at the historic ordnance survey plans for the area, which is what you've got on the screen there, at the time of peak production, they name what was being mined in that area. So we've got Firebrick Grove as a name for a few plots of houses there, which gives a little indication. And of course, Royds works and then brackets Fireclay. And in similar areas and on various editions, it will say Fireclay, coal and ironstone. So it gives a hint of what was being worked in the area. Similarly as well, mine shafts that are recorded as part of this works often have the brackets indicating what they were working. And coal mining is a visible and understood legacy across many parts of Yorkshire, but Fireclay perhaps is something that from those outside of Leeds may be a little bit less familiar with. And so these workings can be sizable and occur as a network of tunnel and voids, having removed beds of minerals from below the now what's heavily developed suburbs. The image you can see now shows a digital representation of the historic mining data above some modern background mapping. You can clearly see a large number of residential houses sat above the disused workings. Now, it's important to state that just because a property does not sit directly above the workings, it does not exempt it from potential settlement and subsidence issues now or indeed in the future. So depending on depth and the style of these workings, the overlying geology and host of other factors, the zone of influence, the ZOI, if you will, is the area of ground at surface that may be affected by subsidence, can vary working to working. This is why myself and the team of mining consultants have taken all the information into account for each mine working, considering it on a case-by-case basis, ensuring that a unique zone of influence is considered for a property when making our initial desk-based assessment. And in the majority of these instances, if a property is underlain by recorded underground fireclay workings, and if there is a possibility of ground movement associated with these workings, then a sort of a visual inspection by a qualified surveyor may be recommended. On these rarer occasions, when workings are recorded at a shallow depth, then a higher risk may be interpreted, and as such, further intrusive investigations may be required. But this would be assessed by our consultants on an individual property basis. So being able to intelligently assess any potential risk to property from these historic workings, this is kind of what really makes our team tick, and being able to accurately assess each individual risk is, what they do on a day-to-day basis. So I said we'd come back to pillar and stool workings, and indeed we will. So looking at this now, we have an extract from historic abandonment plans. This shows Fireclay being worked by the Leeds Fireclay company via pillar and stool workings. So in the first phase of pillar and stool mining, sometimes known as room and pillar mining, tunnels are advanced into the ore body in a rectangular pattern resembling city streets, if you will, if you were to look at it from above. Pillars are left between tunnels to support the weight of the overburden. And this initial phase is known as mining on the advance, from the entrance towards the further reaches of the mineral reserve. And these pillars can range from a few meters squared up to humongous. So I was recently invited into a stone mine up in Dorset, and the pillars that are holding up that working are 6 by 6 meters. So they're quite sizable chunks of stone holding up. So occasionally during a second phase, once advanced mining had been completed, pillars were removed on the retreat. Removing or pulling pillars begins far from the entrance and proceeds towards the entrance. And as these are removed, the mine begins to collapse because nothing remains to support the roof or overburden. Removing pillars causes stresses within the mine to shift and must be planned and executed carefully to reduce danger to miners and control the amount of stress exerted on remaining pillars and the mine floor. Now, whilst there were occasions where the pillars were deliberately pulled to control and collapse the progression of the mine, there were other examples, but with an altogether different and somewhat dangerous motive, perhaps. It is important to remember that these pillars were specifically designed by mining engineers to maintain the structural integrity of the mine's roof. But it was not uncommon, however, at the end of a mine's life for the miners to what's known as rob the pillars in a one last kind of ditch attempt really to raise some much needed cash flow. Miners dug away at the supporting pillars, removing as much of it as possible without causing immediate collapse, enough to remove saleable material and giving them enough structural integrity to get out after their little venture. And whilst it's easy to understand maybe why they needed to do this, if you imagine the sheer desperation, knowing that their operation was due for closure, jobs were to be lost, but to the risk their own lives really, just to get some last money for the operation. Of course, this act was done with not really much thought for the safety of others at the time, who would come into the future, or indeed who would come along at one point and develop the area above. But it's something that we do need to be aware of. So we set the scene a little. We'll cover off a bit about the sources that I use on a day-to-day basis, starting with the historic mining records and talking about the OS mapping as well. So prior to the 19th century, mining really remained largely unrecorded. The Mining Record Office was established in London in the 1840s, and it wasn't until 1872 that a legal act came into action, and you had to then formally deposit an abandonment plan within 3 months of abandoning your mine. You did sometimes have to produce a plan prior to this, but no requirement to formally deposit it anywhere, which meant they all get held in private collections or in people's sheds or lofts or burnt, discarded. And there was no real guidelines on exactly what you had to include in these plans. So lots of them were just vague outlines of the workings that were there with no real indication of their depth or orientation to surface. So from 1883, the Mining Record Office transferred all around the country, transferred to the Home Office. There were a couple of accidents which were called up for more plans to be deposited to try and help reduce risk to miners, and this was responded to quite well. They moved again then to London, from London to Buxton, in the 1930s. After the war happened, there was, of course, we lost quite a few due to bombing raids and things like that. Lots of the archives and plans were affected, but these were then separated out, the remaining plans split between regional areas to make them more accessible. So if you should want to go and have a look, you can pop into your local archive and you can ask to see the mining plans that relate to the village or town, city that you reside in, which is quite good fun. So the plans were then all moved back together at one point during British Coal's working area at Burton-on-Trent, and was inherited then by the Coal Authority as we know them today in 1994, where most of them, the coal ones at least, currently reside in Mansfield. And it's just important to know that having moved around the country so much there, and how they're stored and their history, really, it just, what we have isn't always 100% complete, and the records that we have can be hundreds of years old, and so ensuring their best preservation and interpretation is key, really. So looking at our consultants, Groundsure acquired what was Mining Searches UK in January 2020, along with our 7 mining specialists and 3 geologists. The team has since grown, which is really exciting. So we've been interpreting and investigating mining since 1978. Not me personally, but our team collectively. And so you can see the map there is of Livingston Mine in Yorkshire. This is actually an ironstone mine, but they did work, I believe, some Fireclay as well. And these are all originally paper maps, as we mentioned in the slide before this. But these have all now been digitized by us and interpreted spatially into our digital mapping system. So there's no more problems about conservation or things getting any worse from our point of view in terms of the records. We have the records digitized and preserved. So Groundshore's National Mining Stability Risk Model. This is a tool that Groundsure has developed and used for many years, and whilst it's mining and stability in its mining and stability reports. The model has been developed and refined over 40 years of reporting and investigating mining related risk, and the model now includes even more proprietary and third-party data to ensure a comprehensive assessment is provided for each individual property. So when each report is ordered, which may be off the back of one of our intelligent alerts, it goes through this model to determine the risk to a property. And then when risks are identified, a specialist mining consultant will review all the data available for the property and surrounding area to determine if there is indeed a risk. So now I'm going to hand back over to Andy, who's going to go through some of the reports. It was really great to have the opportunity to speak to you today, and I hope it was informative. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you, Tom. And if you could just click the button for me, mate, as you're still in control. That's great. Yeah, so just to give you an idea of how we fit some of this data into some of our reports, and something that might help you and your clients actually identify when there is a risk and what the next steps and guidance can be. So on the left-hand side, you have the geo-risk report. So this is our definitive report. It covers non-coal mining, which Tom has just been through. It also looks at recorded ground movement from satellite monitoring. And it also looks at natural ground stability hazards, including coastal erosion and sinkholes as well. At the minute, it's the only standalone non-coal mining report available. And then we have the GeoRisk Plus on the right-hand side. So that covers absolutely everything that the GeoRisk does, but it also includes a official CON29M as standard. So this has been ratified by the Law Society, also signed off by the Coal Authority for the use of their data. It includes a mine entry interpretive report, and it also includes a subsidence claims report up to 50 metres as well. And it also includes a Cheshire Brine report if you are in the Cheshire Brine Compensation District. So that is included as standard within that report as well. If you just flick the button, please, Tom. And then if you want everything from an environmental report in one place, then we have a Vista report. So as well as all the mining that is included within the GeoRisk Plus, it also looks fully at contaminated land. It looks at a full flood report. It's got a radon check. It also looks at energy and infrastructure and transportation, so things like HS2 and Crossrail, any sort of wind farms or solar farms. I also looked at planning constraints and planning applications too. So that is an all-in-one residential environmental report that has a full mining solution included in it. Thanks.
Great, thanks ever so much, both of you. I just think now we're about to get to the Q&A part of this webinar, and I can see we have got a couple of questions that have come through. So if anybody else does have any other questions and wanted to ask them, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom. So the first question is for Tom, please. Tom, are pillar and stall workings used anywhere else in the country?
Yes, so pillar and stall workings, they are indeed used throughout the country. We see them predominantly in the Midlands and northern areas, but we do actually have a few examples down in Cornwall as well, which is something that is was new to me before I started in this line of work. And these were alluvial tin deposits where they worked actually underneath a very unstable riverbed, and that was the main way of supporting these workings. So it's not uncommon for them to pop up into other areas indeed.
Okay, great, thanks. And then the other question is also in connection with pillars.
Okay.
So I think, Tom, you're probably best placed to answer it again. Is there any way to know if pillars have been robbed from a mine?
Yeah, so it's a difficult question. Sometimes they do appear on later mine plans when authorities have gone back into the workings to do detailed surveys, but predominantly not. It's not something that is the mine owners would want to specifically shout about that they did. It's just something we have to be more aware about when making our risk assessments. There are photos actually of shallow pillar and stall workings which have been later worked by British Coal and the Coal Authority, where they've taken off layers to start open cast operations, and therefore, if you can imagine, they stripped off the roof of the mine, and they've actually can see the exposed pillars that have been robbed underneath. And it's quite scary to see the limit of what actually is supporting the roof of that mine. So in short answer, no, but it's something that we are very much aware of when assessing risk with pillar and stall workings.
Okay, that's brilliant, thank you. Well, that's it for our questions. So I think that brings us to the end of today's webinar. So I'd like to say a big thank you to Groundsure and Tom and Andy in particular for their time today. And I hope everyone's found this session informative. If you do have any questions about anything you've learned today, or questions in relation to ordering your Groundsure reports through the InfoTrack platform, then you can either contact us using the details on your screen, or of course you can reach out to your account manager, who will be more than happy to assist you. I'd just like to say this session is being recorded, and we will send you a copy so that you can refer back to the notes. So all that's left to say is a big thank you to everyone for joining us today. Thank you again to Tom and Andy, and please enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.